If you've ever wondered what happens when suburban tyranny meets unchecked ego, let me introduce you to Richard, the HOA president of Maplewood Estates. Imagine Napoleon Bonaparte, but instead of commanding armies, he's waging war on trash bins. Instead of a crown, he wears a Bluetooth headset. And instead of conquering Europe, he's enforcing bylaws so ridiculous they might as well be written in crayon. Now picture this pint-sized dictator tasering my pregnant wife over a minor violation. Yes, you heard that right, tasering. Welcome to the most absurd Tuesday morning of my life. It was a sunny Tuesday morning in Maplewood Estates, the kind of suburban utopia where the lawns are unnaturally green, the mailboxes are identical, and the homeowners association, HOA, rules read like a dystopian manifesto. You know the type where stepping out of line means a sternly worded letter, a hefty fine, or, apparently, getting tasered by Richard, the HOA president who took his job far too seriously. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's rewind to the moment my wife Emily's life collided with Richard's power trip. Emily was 7 months pregnant and glowing, though not in the way Richard would later make her glow with 50,000 volts of electricity. She had waddled outside to move our trash bins back to their designated, HOA-approved, spot after forgetting them overnight. It was an honest mistake. She'd been busy growing a human being inside her body. But in Maplewood Estates, there's no room for excuses when it comes to trash bins. The HOA bylaws clearly state that bins left out past 10 p.m. are punishable by fines, or worse, as we were about to discover. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a fluorescent pink notice taped to our front door. It was written in Comic Sans, a font choice that somehow made Richard's authoritarianism even more insufferable. The note read, "Violation number 237. Trash bins left unattended overnight. Immediate action required." Beneath it was Richard's signature, complete with a smug little flourish that practically screamed, "I'm better than you." Emily, being the diplomatic soul she is, decided to handle the situation directly. She figured a polite conversation would suffice, maybe even charm Richard into letting it slide. After all, who could say no to a pregnant woman? Apparently, Richard could. She found him in his natural habitat, pacing around the community clubhouse with a clipboard and a Bluetooth headset that he probably wore just for show. "Richard," Emily began sweetly, "I wanted to apologize for leaving the bins out last night. It won't happen again." Richard didn't even look up from his clipboard. "Mrs. Anderson," he said in a tone that suggested he'd rehearsed this speech in front of a mirror, "the rules are clear. Violations like this disrupt the harmony of our community." Emily blinked. "Richard, it's just trash bins." "It starts with trash bins," he snapped, finally meeting her gaze. "Next thing you know, people are parking RVs on their lawns and hosting unsanctioned barbecues." Unsanctioned barbecues? Was this guy serious? Emily tried again. "Look, I understand you're just doing your job." "I am doing my job," Richard interrupted, puffing out his chest like he was about to deliver the Gettysburg Address. "And my job is to ensure Maplewood Estates remains a beacon of order and civility." At this point, Emily realized she wasn't dealing with a rational human being, but rather a dictator trapped in khakis and loafers. She decided to cut her losses and walk away, but Richard wasn't done. "Wait!" he barked as she turned toward home. "You can't just leave. This is an official HOA matter." Emily sighed and turned back around. "Richard," she said firmly, "I'm 7 months pregnant. I don't have time for this." That's when it happened, the moment that would forever cement Richard's place as Maplewood Estates' most infamous tyrant. Without warning or provocation, he pulled out a taser from his clipboard. Yes, apparently it had a hidden compartment, and fired it at my wife. Now, I know what you're thinking. Surely this is an exaggeration. But let me assure you, if anything, I'm underplaying how absurd this scene was. There stood Richard, triumphant and panting like he'd just conquered Everest, while Emily lay on the ground stunned but thankfully unharmed. The taser itself wasn't particularly powerful, more of a glorified cattle prod than anything else, but it was enough to send shockwaves through our quiet neighborhood, both literally and figuratively. Within minutes, neighbors emerged from their homes like meerkats popping out of burrows to witness the commotion. "Oh my God!" shouted Mrs. Peterson from across the street as she clutched her pearls like an extra in a soap opera. "Is she okay?" yelled Mr. Gomez while fumbling with his phone to record what was sure to become viral footage. Meanwhile, Richard stood frozen in place as if realizing for the first time that tasering pregnant women isn't generally considered acceptable behavior, even by HOA standards. By the time I arrived on the scene, having been summoned by frantic texts from Emily, chaos had fully erupted. Paramedics were checking her vitals while police officers debated whether or not they could arrest Richard under some obscure statute about misuse of non-lethal weapons. "What happened?" I demanded as I pushed through the crowd. Emily looked up at me from her stretcher with an expression that was equal parts exhausted and incredulous. "He tasered me," she said simply. I turned to Richard, who was now sweating profusely under the weight of public scrutiny. "You tasered my pregnant wife?" I asked incredulously. "It was self-defense," he stammered weakly. "Self-defense? Against trash bins?" Richard opened his mouth to respond but quickly closed it again when he realized there was no plausible explanation for his actions, not even one involving unsanctioned barbecues. As paramedics loaded Emily into an ambulance, more for precaution than necessity, I made her a promise. "Don't worry," I said quietly but firmly. "This isn't over." And thus began my quest. Not just for justice, but for something far sweeter: revenge. But let's save that part for later, because today isn't about what comes next. It's about how one man's obsession with HOA bylaws led him down a path so ridiculous that even Kafka would have called it over the top. John was not the kind of man to let things slide. The moment Emily was safely home from the hospital, resting with her feet up and a bowl of ice cream balanced precariously on her belly, he got to work. Revenge wasn't just a dish best served cold. It was a 5-course meal, and John was ready to feast. His first step? Learning everything there was to know about HOA regulations, bylaws, and, most importantly, Richard's track record as president. Armed with a laptop and a pot of coffee strong enough to wake the dead, John dove into the HOA's governing documents. These weren't just rules, they were manifestos. The bylaws dictated everything from acceptable mailbox colors, beige or white only, to lawn height, no more than 2.5 inches. There were even clauses about holiday decorations. No inflatable Santas, no blinking lights, and absolutely no wreaths with glitter. It was like Richard had personally designed the bylaws to crush joy under his loafer-clad heel. But John wasn't looking for glitter bands, he was looking for dirt. And boy, did he find it. Turns out Richard had been running the HOA like his own personal fiefdom for years. He'd fined residents for infractions that didn't exist, selectively enforced rules against people he didn't like, and used HOA funds to pay for administrative expenses that suspiciously resembled golf outings and steak dinners. John's favorite discovery, though, was the HOA's financial records, or rather, the lack thereof. According to the bylaws, residents had the right to inspect these records at any time. Yet when John requested them through official channels, Richard responded with a curt email: "Financial documents are confidential and not available for public viewing." This was not only shady but also illegal. John knew he had him. The next step in John's plan was gathering allies. He started knocking on doors, clipboard in hand like some kind of anti-Richard crusader. Most of the neighbors were eager to talk. They'd all been victims of Richard's reign of terror at one point or another. Mrs. Peterson shared how she'd been fined $500 for planting hydrangeas instead of azaleas in her front yard. Mr. Gomez recounted how Richard had threatened to tow his car because it was parked too close to the curb on trash day. Even sweet old Mrs. Jenkins admitted she'd been slapped with a violation notice for leaving her porch light on past midnight. By the end of the week, John had compiled a dossier thick enough to rival an FBI file on organized crime. He also had signatures from nearly every resident in Maplewood Estates demanding Richard's removal as HOA president. But John wasn't done yet. He wanted to hit Richard where it hurt most: his ego. So he called for an emergency HOA meeting at the community clubhouse. The agenda? Addressing leadership concerns. The tone? Purely professional, on paper at least. The meeting was packed. Every resident showed up, along with a few curious passersby who'd heard rumors about the tasering incident. Richard strutted in last, clipboard in hand and Bluetooth headset firmly in place, clearly expecting this to be another opportunity to flex his authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began pompously, "thank you for attending this important discussion about our community's future." John stood up before Richard could launch into one of his trademark monologues about civic harmony. "Actually," he said loudly enough to silence the room, "we're here to discuss your leadership." Richard blinked rapidly like a malfunctioning robot. "My leadership? What do you mean?" John smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that promised chaos. "I mean your misuse of funds, selective enforcement of rules, and general incompetence as president." The crowd murmured in agreement as John began presenting his evidence. Emails denying access to financial records, receipts for steak dinners labeled as community outreach, photos of Richard golfing during HOA work hours, and testimonials from residents who'd been unfairly targeted by his fines. Richard tried to interrupt several times but was drowned out by boos from the audience. At one point, Mrs. Jenkins stood up and shouted, "You fined me $200 for having fairy lights on my porch." Fairy lights. Richard's face turned redder than Mrs. Peterson's hydrangeas as John continued dismantling him piece by piece. By the time John finished his presentation, which included a PowerPoint slide titled Richard's Greatest Hits, a compilation of corruption, the room was practically buzzing with righteous anger. But John wasn't done yet. He saved his trump card for last. A formal petition signed by 90% of Maplewood Estates residents demanding Richard's immediate resignation. Richard stared at the petition like it was written in hieroglyphics. "This is absurd," he sputtered. "You can't just remove me. I'm the president." "Not anymore," said John calmly as he handed over the petition to the HOA board members present at the meeting. The board members exchanged glances before announcing their decision. Effective immediately, Richard was removed from his position as HOA president, pending further investigation into his actions. The room erupted into cheers as Richard stormed out muttering threats about lawsuits and revenge, though nobody took him seriously anymore. As neighbors celebrated their newfound freedom from tyranny with impromptu champagne toasts, courtesy of Mrs. Jenkins, John leaned back in his chair feeling more satisfied than he had in years. Sure, there was still work to be done. Audits needed conducting, bylaws needed revising, but for now, victory tasted sweet. And somewhere in Maplewood Estates that night sat Richard alone in his house, surrounded by beige mailboxes and perfectly trimmed lawns, wondering how it all went so wrong, while John enjoyed a well-earned slice of victory pie back home with Emily and their soon-to-be-born baby. Because if there's one thing suburban dictators should know by now, never mess with trash bins or pregnant women or husbands who own clipboards and PowerPoint skills. John thought the saga was over. Richard had been dethroned. The HOA board was investigating his misuse of funds, and Maplewood Estates was finally free from the iron grip of its khaki-clad tyrant. But Richard wasn't the kind of man to go down quietly. No, he was the kind of man who would double down on his absurdity, like a gambler betting everything on a pair of twos. And that's exactly what he did. It started with a lawsuit. Yes, Richard sued John for defamation, claiming that John's PowerPoint presentation had irreparably damaged his reputation. Never mind the fact that Richard's reputation had been built on fining old ladies for fairy lights and tasering pregnant women. He was determined to make John pay. The lawsuit itself was a masterpiece of delusion. Richard's lawyer, who looked suspiciously like he'd been hired off Craigslist, filed a complaint that read like it had been written by someone who'd skimmed one episode of Law and Order. It accused John of maliciously orchestrating a smear campaign and demanded $50,000 in damages, plus an apology letter suitable for framing. When John received the court summons, he didn't panic. Instead, he laughed. A deep, belly laugh that startled Emily and made her drop her bowl of ice cream. "He's suing me?" John said incredulously. "For telling the truth?" Emily raised an eyebrow. "You're not worried?" "Worried? No. Annoyed? Absolutely." John decided to fight fire with fire, or, more accurately, fight absurdity with absurdity. He hired his own lawyer, a sharp-witted woman named Linda who had a reputation for dismantling frivolous lawsuits with surgical precision. Linda took one look at Richard's complaint and smirked. This is going to be fun. The court date arrived faster than expected, and Maplewood Estates turned out in full force to witness the showdown. The courtroom was packed with neighbors clutching popcorn like they were at a matinee showing of HOA Wars. The reckoning. Even Mrs. Jenkins brought her knitting needles, ready to settle in for what promised to be an entertaining spectacle. Richard strutted into the courtroom wearing a suit that was at least 2 sizes too big and carrying a briefcase that looked suspiciously empty. He nodded smugly at his supporters, which consisted entirely of his lawyer and one guy who owed him money for golf lessons. John entered next, calm and collected, with Linda by his side. She carried an actual binder full of evidence, which immediately made Richard's briefcase look even more ridiculous. The proceedings began with Richard's lawyer delivering an opening statement that could generously be described as word salad. He rambled about character assassination and the sanctity of HOA leadership before accidentally referring to Richard as Mr. Dictator. The crowd erupted in laughter. Linda's opening statement was much shorter and devastatingly effective. She outlined how everything John had presented at the HOA meeting was backed by evidence. Emails, receipts, testimonials, and even Richard's own words. She ended with a flourish. This lawsuit isn't about defamation. It's about one man's inability to accept accountability for his actions. Richard squirmed in his seat as Linda began presenting her case. She called witnesses from Maplewood Estates who testified about Richard's abuses of power. Mrs. Peterson recounted her hydrangea fine. Mr. Gomez described the curb incident. Mrs. Jenkins read aloud her violation notice for fairy lights, which she'd framed as a joke. Each testimony painted a picture of a man drunk on authority but completely devoid of common sense. Then came the piece de resistance. Linda unveiled financial records obtained through subpoenas that showed exactly how Richard had spent HOA funds. There were charges for steak dinners labeled as community outreach, golf outings listed as team-building exercises, and even a purchase for a taser marked as security equipment. The crowd gasped audibly when Linda revealed the total amount misappropriated: $15,000. Richard's lawyer tried to object but only managed to knock over his water glass in the process. Meanwhile, Richard looked like he wanted to crawl under the defendant's table and disappear. When it was time for cross-examination, Linda turned her attention to Richard himself. She asked him pointed questions about his leadership style, his financial decisions, and, of course, the tasering incident. "Mr. Richard," she began sweetly, "can you explain why you felt it necessary to purchase a taser using HOA funds?" Richard stammered incoherently before blurting out, "It was for self-defense." "Self-defense against what?" Linda pressed. "Against unruly residents." The crowd burst into laughter again as Linda raised an eyebrow. Unruly residents like Mrs. Jenkins? Or perhaps Mrs. Anderson, who happens to be 7 months pregnant? Richard turned beet red but said nothing. By the time closing arguments rolled around, it was clear which way the wind was blowing, and it wasn't in Richard's favor. Linda delivered a final statement so scathing it could have melted steel. "This lawsuit is not just frivolous. It's an insult to everyone who has ever been wronged by Mr. Richard's actions as HOA president." The judge didn't even need time to deliberate. He dismissed the case on the spot and ordered Richard to pay all court fees. A decision met with thunderous applause from the audience. As neighbors filed out of the courtroom celebrating their victory over suburban tyranny, John couldn't help but feel satisfied. Not just because he'd won, but because justice had finally been served. Richard slunk out last, muttering something about appealing the decision, but nobody paid him any attention anymore. Back at home that evening, Emily hugged John tightly and said with a smile, "You really showed him." John grinned back. "I told you, never mess with trash bins or pregnant women." And so ended another chapter in Maplewood Estates' most ridiculous saga. A tale of trash bins, tasers, and one man's quest for revenge against suburban dictatorship. Because sometimes justice isn't just blind, it's hilarious too. After the courtroom debacle, you'd think Richard would have learned his lesson. But no, Richard was like a cockroach in a nuclear apocalypse. Impossible to get rid of and somehow still scuttling around, making everyone's life miserable. While the lawsuit had been a spectacular failure, he wasn't done trying to claw his way back to power. Rumors started circulating that Richard was planning a comeback, as if he were some washed-up rock star instead of an HOA president who'd tasered a pregnant woman and embezzled community funds. John, however, was done playing defense. If Richard wanted to escalate things, John was more than ready to meet him at the top of the ridiculousness ladder. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about ensuring that Richard never had the chance to terrorize Maplewood Estates again. The first step in John's master plan? A full financial audit of the HOA. With Linda's help, John petitioned the board to bring in an independent auditor to comb through every penny Richard had ever touched. It didn't take long for the results to come in, and they were glorious. Not only had Richard misused funds for personal expenses, but he'd also been double-dipping, charging residents for special assessments that went straight into his own pocket. The audit report was 87 pages long and read like a crime novel, complete with receipts for $300 bottles of wine labeled as office supplies and invoices for consulting fees paid to a company that turned out to be owned by Richard's cousin. The piece de resistance? A $1,200 charge for emergency landscaping services that coincided suspiciously with the installation of a koi pond in Richard's backyard. Armed with this new ammunition, John called another community meeting. This time, it wasn't just about removing Richard, it was about holding him accountable in every possible way. The turnout was even bigger than before. People were practically lining up outside the clubhouse like it was Black Friday at Best Buy. Richard showed up too, because of course he did. He walked in with his head held high and his Bluetooth headset firmly in place, as if he hadn't just been exposed as the Bernie Madoff of suburban governance. He even had the audacity to bring donuts, which no one touched because everyone assumed they were poisoned, or at least purchased with stolen HOA funds. John took the floor with the confidence of a man who knew he was about to drop an atomic bomb of truth. He started by summarizing the audit findings in simple terms for anyone who hadn't read all 87 pages. Richard stole your money to buy wine, build a koi pond, and pay his cousin for doing absolutely nothing. The crowd gasped collectively, like an audience watching a particularly juicy plot twist on a reality TV show. Richard tried to interrupt, something about how the koi pond was a necessary community improvement. But John shut him down with a single raised hand. "Richard," he said calmly, "you've already embarrassed yourself enough. Let's not add lying under oath to your list of accomplishments." The meeting ended with unanimous votes on 3 key actions: filing criminal charges against Richard for embezzlement, suing him civilly to recover the stolen funds, and banning him from ever holding any position of authority within Maplewood Estates again. As residents cheered and high-fived each other like they just won a championship game, Richard slunk out of the clubhouse looking like someone had popped his Bluetooth headset balloon. But John wasn't done yet. Oh no, there was still one final act in this revenge saga, a cherry on top of the Justice Sunday. A week later, Maplewood Estates hosted its annual community barbecue, a tradition that Richard had previously banned because he claimed it violated fire safety regulations. Translation: he wasn't invited. This year's barbecue was different. It was rebranded as the Freedom Feast, complete with banners that read "Goodbye Richard," and t-shirts featuring cartoon drawings of trash bins with halos. John made sure everything was perfect. Live music from a local band, bounce houses for the kids, and enough food to feed an army. But the highlight of the event came midway through when John took the stage with a microphone in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, grinning from ear to ear, "as you all know, we've been through a lot lately, but today isn't just about celebrating our victory. It's about making sure we never forget what we've overcome." With that, he unveiled a plaque mounted on a brick pedestal in the middle of the park. It read, "In memory of our struggle against tyranny, the Great Trash Bin Rebellion of Maplewood Estates." Beneath it was an engraved image of a trash bin with lightning bolts shooting out of it, a not-so-subtle nod to Emily's tasering incident. The crowd erupted into laughter and applause as neighbors gathered around to take selfies with the plaque. Even Emily couldn't stop giggling as she posed next to it with her now very prominent baby bump. As for Richard, well, word on the street was that he'd moved out of Maplewood Estates altogether, something about needing a fresh start. Rumor had it he'd taken up residence in another HOA community 2 towns over. Whether or not they knew what they were getting into remained unclear. Back at home that evening, John sat on the couch next to Emily, who was happily munching on yet another bowl of ice cream. "So," she said between bites, "do you think it's finally over?" John leaned back with a satisfied sigh. "I think so," he replied. "But if it isn't, well, I've still got my clipboard." Because if there's one thing John had learned throughout this entire ordeal, it was this: never underestimate the power of petty vengeance when combined with meticulous organization skills. And so life returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be in Maplewood Estates after toppling its very own suburban dictator. The lawns stayed green, the mailboxes stayed beige, and trash bins were left out overnight without fear of retribution. Justice had been served, and it tasted even better than Mrs. Jenkins' famous potato salad.